Unbelievable.
Maddening. Impossible.
Suzanne, they always told me nothing was impossible.
Failure, she said. Failure was impossible.
And yet, here we are. Listen, in 2020, 1/3 of Americans eligible to vote did not. That's some 80 million votes. And nearly half of them are women.
But after all we did to get them the right to vote.
Oh, and this. Since 1920, when women were given the right to vote.
Given? We weren't given anything, and we fought for it.
For over 70 years.
And we kept on fighting, even though we realized that we may probably not see that in our lifetime.
Well, of course we did. We did it for our daughters and our granddaughters.
We did it for future generations of women.
Don't women these days know this?
But it must be in the history books.
Which I hear say were written by men.
Barely a mention, I've heard.
After we wrote 3 full volumes of our own history.
Well, if they are not voting, I don't think they're reading books from the 1880s.
Books.
And if they read them, they've forgotten.
Yes, books. I don't even read. I never had. In fact, it was forbidden for those in slavery to read. So I learned by listening, and then I used my words to inspire others.
Tell your story. Why not? Sojourner, you've been around the longest. Why don't you start?
I'll tell our story. My story. It started long before me. In 1776, Abigail Adams wrote her famous letter, Remember the Ladies, urging her husband John to include women's rights, not just men, in the Declaration of Independence. And she told him how much she hated slavery.
That's right. And Abigail Adams had a loving and a supportive husband, but she knew that once a woman was married, she became the property of the husband with no legal rights at all.
I know about not having rights. I grew up in slavery. And so I know about that because I, number one, was Black and also a woman. I believe that all women should be treated with dignity. And so I learned to speak up and out against all the injustices.
Your speeches were like poetry, Sojourner. Oh, so powerful and often quoted or written down, like that one you wrote about being a woman that you delivered in Akron, Ohio in 1851.
Although that Miss Frances Gage, oh God knows she got her version all wrong. As you know, I don't speak in a Southern dialect. It is Dutch.
I believed as thee did, Sojourner. I was raised a Quaker woman, and as such I was taught that there is an inner light inside of all people, and that all people, regardless of their race or their gender, were equal, and therefore all people were equal.
Yes.
My ancestor, Benjamin Franklin, was an abolitionist, and I went very deeply into that movement. I married an abolitionist. I started my own female anti-slavery society, and I was the first person in all of Philadelphia to hold integrated meetings. Sojourner, thee and I were great friends at that time.
Yes.
I married an abolitionist too, and when we spent our honeymoon at the first International Anti-Slavery Convention in London, that's where I met you, Lucretia. You changed my life. She gave me my own voice, especially when we saw how those women were being treated. We were pushed off to the side, told we were forbidden to speak.
Oh, I know that feeling.
And that is why, when we were sailing home, we decided to hold our own convention to discuss women's rights.
And that you did. Seneca Falls, 1848. That was your claim to fame, Mrs. Stanton.
Oh, it wasn't all me. I had Lucretia there too, but I did write that declaration of sentiments demanding equal rights for education opportunities, for property rights, marriage and divorce equality, and demanded that women be given the right to vote.
I feared the outrage, but Lizzie persisted, and I'm glad she did.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
as I heard it, very many people were shocked when you actually suggested that women should have the vote. And yet, by the second day, 100 people, men and women, signed your document, including my parents.
Oh, thanks to my dear friend Frederick Douglass. He stood up and he demanded that women be given the voice at the polls to speak up. And it stirred the people. Yes, it stirred the people.
He was the one reporter that we were happy to have there.
And it was only a few years later that I met you, Mrs. Stanton, and life was never the same. You know, I was actually a bit of a latecomer to this movement. I was born a Quaker and I was raised an abolitionist, and now I see that all along the earliest suffragists and the most dedicated suffragists had already been fighting their own fight against slavery. And they understood that women also have been abused and suffered indignities and under the law. And they also understood that equality means equal rights for black and white, men and women. We formed a wonderful relationship. Since Mrs. Stanton was busy raising 7 children, I would have to go to her home, and I would hold those babies on my lap, or I would stir the pot on the stove so that she could write. She wrote very many of the early speeches. And while I was stirring the pot, she was stirring me with her words, and I was able to go out and stir the world. She forged the thunderbolts, and I fired them.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yes, they did, Susan. And what a fiery delivery they developed, even in the face of criticism and often violence.
I know about violence. Once when I was speaking, these men, they threatened to burn the building I was in down if I was to speak. And I said, then burn the building down because I would speak from the ashes.
Oh, yes. Traveling the country, preaching about women getting the right to vote, that's a dangerous venture. And there were so many horrible insults and threats, sometimes even death threats. And you know that sometimes it wasn't just the men, sometimes it was the women who tried to stop us. They felt somehow that a woman speaking in public or a woman with a voice at the polls was scandalous in their minds.
But yet we kept on fighting.
And after all we did, once the black man won equality and the right to vote, we women were denied it. And the government said we should wait again for another generation or 2.
It caused a split in the movement and made me sick as a rat.
And with such little support from Congress, there were times that we all felt like we couldn't go on.
But we did.
You and Elizabeth did. But Mrs. Mott and I were coming to the end of our journey.
But there were new and younger faces showing up at the meetings.
Yes.
And there were brave and passionate voices still being heard.
And they were the ones that realized our dreams.
Maybe we should let them tell their stories like we told ours.
I agree. Let them tell the rest.
And perhaps change the news like this.
Maybe those 40 million women that did not exercise their right to vote will exercise their given right to vote.
I will drink to that.
Here, here.